Hey there, curious minds. Welcome back to the deep dive, where we sift through the sources to, you know, unearth those nuggets of knowledge that truly make you well informed.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're diving into a topic that really touches on identity, access, and how we classify human difference. Specifically, how our understanding of neurodivergence, autism, and ADHD is often shaped and sometimes, constrained by diagnostic systems.
It's a really crucial conversation, I think, and one that moves beyond just simple definitions to explore the profound personal and systemic impacts of how we categorize things.
Yeah.
We've got a powerful piece to guide us titled When Checklists Become Cages, Autism, ADHD, and the DSM's Blind Spots, plus some other research too. It helps us understand what happens when the desire for diagnostic certainty clashes with the messy overlapping realities of actual lived experience.
Right. So our mission today is to truly unpack how these diagnostic manuals influence everything, from recognition and access to care, right down to personal identity, and, importantly, to consider what alternative perspectives might offer us. So if you've ever felt like life just doesn't quite fit neatly into those predefined boxes, this deep dive is definitely for you. Okay, let's explore this.
Let's do it.
We often look to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as this sort of authoritative text, right? Promising to transform the vast spectrum of human difference into something orderly, classifiable.
The promise of clarity.
But from what our sources indicate, what's the actual lived experience for those seeking diagnosis for autism or ADHD under its criteria? Does it deliver that clarity?
Well, what often arrives, according to the research we've looked at, is quite the opposite of inclusion. Often, it's exclusion.
Oh.
Take the DSM-5-TR, for instance, updated in 2022. Notably tightened its diagnostic criteria. For an autism diagnosis now, it demands that all 3 criteria for social communication and all 4 for restrictive and repetitive behaviors must be met.
All of them, not just like most.
Nope, all of them. Is even one, and in the manual's eyes, you're simply not autistic.
Wow. And it's a strikingly similar story for ADHD, isn't it?
It really is. Adults need 5 traits of inattention or hyperactivity impulsivity. Children need 6.
Okay.
And crucially, these traits must be traced back to before age 12 and consistently displayed across multiple settings, like home and school.
Right, so it's not just one area.
Exactly. So one fewer trait, maybe a slight inconsistency in how it shows up, or even just an absence of documented history from childhood, and that's it. You're effectively erased from the diagnostic picture.
Erased. That's a strong word.
It is. And what's really striking here is that this isn't presented as just, an accidental oversight or some minor editorial update. Our source actually describes it as mathematics masquerading as medicine.
Mathematics masquerading as medicine.
Wow.
What does that imply?
Well, the research suggests this tightening wasn't necessarily driven purely by new scientific understanding. It suggests it might have been a deliberate political maneuver designed to stem a tide of diagnoses and essentially manage numbers.
Manage numbers, rather than accurately reflecting clinical reality.
That's the argument presented, yeah. Less a scientific correction, more policy decision.
That's quite an indictment.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, if it's not purely scientific, what other drivers are influencing these diagnostic shifts.
It does raise questions.
And I also find it fascinating how much power the DSM holds, particularly in America, as the clinician's main text for defining these conditions. Globally, we have the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, which provides the codes often crucial for billing and insurance, right?
That's right. The ICD codes are what get used for practical things like insurance claims.
So it creates this powerful, almost coercive loop. To get treatment covered, you often need an ICD code, which in turn means you have to fit neatly into a DSM category first, because that's often what determines the code.
Exactly. And as our source explains, this is precisely where the lived life, is squeezed into shape, sometimes against their own reality, just to fit the system.
Squeezed into shape, yeah.
And it's not a neutral process either. The research highlights that this whole system carries an inheritance of eugenics and empire.
Eugenics. How so?
Well, the argument is that the categories themselves were historically rooted in sorting lives, sorting them into fit and unfit, useful and useless.
Gosh.
The DSM, in this particular view, functions a bit like a colonial map, reflecting the priorities of its authors and psychiatry's historical need to control and classify. And its influence extends globally, sometimes pushing aside local understandings of human difference.
That's a really profound point that the framework itself might carry these historical biases.
Mhm.
Something else that's really intriguing emerges when we look closer at the DSM's categories, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Because research consistently suggests that neurodivergence, like autism and ADHD, isn't always so neatly separated. They often blur, overlap, and intertwine.
Absolutely. The data on comorbidity, that's when both conditions are present in one person, is incredibly high. Ranges from like 30 to 80% depending on the study.
30 to 80%, that's huge.
It is. Some reviews even place it between 40 and 83%. And Quinn studies, they really underscore this. They suggest up to 72% of the covariance between ADHD and autism traits can be explained by shared genetic factors.
72%.
Yeah. It's almost as if they're, as the source puts it, different movements within the same song.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So if the science increasingly points to this intertwining, this overlap, why then, even when the DSM-5 finally allowed for a dual diagnosis, which earlier editions actually forbade, right?
Right, you couldn't officially have both before DSM-5.
So even with that change, why has the system seemed so reluctant to fully embrace that dimensional reality? Why stick to such rigid boxes?
It's a great question, and the research points to a clear gap between the data and the practice. One study, for example, found that out of kids who clearly met criteria for both autism and ADHD, only 15.8% actually received both diagnoses.
Only 15%, even when they met the criteria.
That's what the study found. This categorical imposition, as our source terms it, means that individuals who maybe live in the almost, or whose impairments aren't arranged in the exact sanctioned pattern of the manual, they're routinely denied recognition, and with that, vital supports.
Living in the almost. And this diagnostic erasure, it seems, falls especially hard on certain groups, like those assigned female at birth.
Yes, definitely. They are often, whether through cultural expectation or just necessity, trained to mask, to suppress their traits, to appear acceptable, essentially, to survive socially or professionally.
Right. You learn to fit in.
Exactly. But the DSM's rigid arithmetic, in a cruel twist, often rewards this very survival strategy with further exclusion. What looks like resilience in one context becomes invisibility in the diagnostic one.
So your coping mechanism works against you getting help.
Pretty much, leading to what our source terms gaslighting by design. The system itself seems to invalidate your experience because you learn to hide it too well.
Gaslighting by design, that's chilling. Given these significant issues with the DSM's rigid checklist approach, it really begs the question, is there another way? Another way to understand human difference and distress?
There are alternatives being explored.
Our sources delve into one powerful alternative, something called the power threat, meaning framework, or PTMF. What's that about?
The PTMF represents a really radical departure. Instead of starting with the question, what disorder do you have? It asks fundamentally different, more human questions.
Like what?
Questions like, what has happened to you? How is it affecting you? What sense have you made of it? And what did you need to do to survive?
Wow, those are very different questions.
Completely different. They're not diagnostic questions in the traditional sense. They're questions centered on understanding a person's life context, their experiences, their narrative.
That's a huge shift in perspective. It reframes neurodivergence, like autism and ADHD, not as some kind of internal defect, but more as, well, as ways of adapting, enduring, and creating meaning in a world that's often hostile or just plain unaccommodating to difference.
Precisely. It highlights how the very traits that psychiatry might pathologize can be understood differently as powerful, often necessary survival strategies, adaptations.
So what the DSM might call sub-threshold-like, not quite meeting the diagnostic cutoff.
Yeah, from a PTMF lens, that isn't necessarily an absence of experience or difference. It might reflect environments that fail to recognize and accommodate non-normative ways of being.
So the problem isn't just in the person, but in the fit between the person and their environment.
Exactly. And from this perspective, the tightening of the DSM-5 TR criteria doesn't look like scientific refinement. It reveals itself more as a power move.
A power move.
Yeah, a way to shrink categories, restrict access to care, contain the numbers. Rather than genuinely serving individual truth, it's seen as an exercise of authority, drawing lines that determine who gets acknowledged and who gets effectively erased.
Okay, I see. And the consequences of this diagnostic approach, these checklists as cages, they stretch across a person's entire life, don't they?
They really do.
We see children, right from a young age, getting caught in these narrowing diagnostic gates.
Yes, the impact starts early. Girls, for instance, often expected to be quiet, compliant. They can mask themselves right into invisibility.
Right.
Trans and non-binary children often find their divergence doubly erased because their ways of being already challenge the binary logics and gender that underpin so much.
That makes sense.
Children of color, unfortunately, are statistically more likely to be mislabeled, seen as oppositional or disruptive rather than potentially autistic or ADHD.
Different labels for similar behaviors.
And then there are Gestalt language processors, kids whose language emerges differently, often in whole phrases or chunks rather than word by word. They're almost entirely misread by standard assessments.
How so?
Well, take hyperlexia and advanced reading abilities some kids have. It can sometimes mask really profound struggles with language comprehension. The child might read fluently, but not grasp the meaning. The DSM often lacks the nuance for this complexity. These kids are just too often misunderstood by practitioners focused on standard milestones.
So the checklist misses the real picture. And for adults, the weight of this diagnostic absence or misdiagnosis, it's profoundly different, isn't it?
It is. Many grew up before dual diagnoses were even allowed, remember?
Yeah.
Or maybe they just didn't fit the narrow male white archetypes that historically dominated psychiatry's understanding of these conditions.
Right, the classic textbook cases.
Yeah. So they often collected other diagnoses along the way. Depression, anxiety, maybe bipolar labels that never quite captured the full picture of their being. This could lead to years of misunderstanding, ineffective treatments, and then, for some, a late diagnosis that brings both immense relief and also grief for lost time.
Relief and grief. Yeah, I can imagine.
And there's a particular kind of cruelty in the present day, too. And if you were diagnosed years ago under older criteria, being reassessed now under the tighter DSM-5-TR rules risks erasure all over again.
So you could lose your diagnosis.
Absolutely. Someone who has lived their life identifying as autistic, built community, developed coping strategies around that truth. They could suddenly be told they're no longer autistic because they miss one criterion on the new checklist.
Oh my gosh.
And with that comes the devastating loss of services, supports, accommodations, and often a fundamental blow to their sense of self and community. Recognition under the DSM, as our source explains it, is not stable. It is conditional. The shadow of potential diagnostic erasure really lengthens with age.
Conditional recognition. That's tough. To really bring this home, the research we studied shares a deeply personal account, doesn't it? One that embodies these exact challenges.
It does. It's quite powerful.
Imagine navigating the medical system as someone who is ADHD, so both autistic and ADHD, and a Gestalt language processor, and also lives with a rare, extremely painful condition called erythromelalgia. That causes severe burning pain in the hands and feet.
That's a lot of intersecting complexities.
Right. This individual describes their medical encounters as incredibly fraught. They struggled profoundly to narrate their pain in the way doctors expect, on a scale of 1 to 10. For them, it wasn't a gradual scale. It was often like a switch from tolerable to completely unbearable.
So the standard questions didn't work for their experience?
Not at all. They faced dismissal, mistrust, and went through near-fatal incidents where doctors simply couldn't recognize how their neurology, their rare disease, their communication style, and even their physical size, they mentioned being 6'7" and 410 pounds, all intersected.
Wow. How did size play into it?
Dosing became lethal guesswork. The standard charts just didn't account for a body like theirs, especially when combined with the other factors.
Gosh.
And in those moments of crisis, when their language would collapse under stress into meltdown or shutdown, they describe doctors just stopping seeking consent, essentially assuming their medical authority outweighed the patient's agency because the patient couldn't communicate in the expected way at that moment.
That's terrifying.
It's a stark, devastating example of a medical system that, as the source points out, cannot fathom the overlap of differences. And it often punishes atypical communication, treating the whole human being as an inconvenience when parts don't fit the expected protocol or checklist.
It's described as a deeper violence. A medical culture where the very systems supposedly there to sustain life can ironically become sites of its greatest danger for those who don't fit neatly into the established categories.
Yeah.
It powerfully highlights how, for many people, seeking care means entering rooms already braced for arrogance, braced for dismissal, where your own embodied truth is erased in favor of the chart or the checklist.
Erased in favor of the checklist. This deep dive really reveals that, as the source says, it did not have to be this way. Our source points to a lost vision from way back in the 1920s, a buried alternative, the pioneering work of a psychiatrist named Dr. Grunya Sukareva.
Sukareva, yes. Her work was remarkably different. Her descriptions of autistic children weren't just deficit lists like we often see. They were described as careful portraits.
Careful portraits.
Yeah, attentive to the child's temperament, their creativity, their resilience. She saw her patients as whole beings embedded in relationships, shaped by both their innate disposition and their environment. Her whole approach was holistic, deeply humane. Crafting responses that genuinely honored the individual child. It was a psychiatry centered on relationship, story, and survival.
That sounds radically different. Holistic, humane, relational.
It really was.
Yet her vision was tragically buried. Why?
Well, history took a different turn. Instead, the voices of Kanner and Asperger, whose work was, according to this analysis, steeped in eugenic logics of sorting, gained prominence and carried forward into the systems we have now.
So the need to classify one out.
Essentially, yes. The classificatory impulse triumphed over the relational, giving rise to the DSM's lineage of exclusion and checklists that we've been talking about.
So the DSM-5-TR, with its tightening diagnostic thresholds, it isn't just some neutral progression of inevitable science.
According to this perspective, no. It's seen as a continuation of choices made a century ago. Choices that prioritize systems built for eugenics, for insurance purposes, for institutional control, over the kind of holistic relational care Sukareva envisioned. It truly highlights that another, much more humane path was always possible.
Another path was possible. We've journeyed through how the DSM draws its lines, often presenting them as this kind of immutable truth. But what we've discovered really is that perhaps truth often emerges elsewhere, in different forms.
Indeed. And truth, as that PTMF framework powerfully reminds us, is ultimately found in the stories. The stories of how power acts upon us, how threats are endured, and the meanings we forge just to survive. Story isn't less rigorous than checklists. The argument is that it is, in many ways, more honest. It attends to the complexities, the nuances, the lived reality that the arithmetic of diagnostic criteria simply cannot hold.
That's a really important takeaway. So for you listening out there, living as autistic, ADHD, or ADHD, it's not about failing a diagnostic manual. It's not about whether you check enough boxes.
Yeah.
It is about surviving, often against considerable odds, in a world that, frankly, wasn't built with your neurotype in mind. Every adaptation, every strategy you've developed, every single act of persistence is a testament to your strength and your unique way of being in the world.
Absolutely. And this deep dive reminds us that another path was always possible, as Dr. Sukareva's forgotten work shows. So maybe the call to action here isn't solely focused on winning recognition from the DSM's ever-tightening thresholds.
What is it then?
Perhaps it's also about turning toward each other, building communities of care where our overlaps, our diverse life cycles, our embodied differences, where those are held as truth, unconditionally, regardless of what any manual says.
It's communities of care.
Yeah, the manual will continue to draw its lines, that's likely. But as the source powerfully concludes, those lines can be crossed. They can be ignored or rewritten or rendered irrelevant by networks of solidarity that insist we were never absent.
We were never absent. I like that.
Consider how you might help make a different map. A map drawn not by the rigid logic of classification, but by the lived routes of those who found each other and built support along the way.